Story 1. At 9 or 10 years old, Hulk Hogan was being sat on by Yokozuna, and the announcer said something like, "Hogan's rib cage is being shattered." So, I sat down and started writing a letter to Hogan, wishing him a speedy recovery and saying I was sorry he got hurt. My mom asked me what I was doing. I told her, and then she sat me down at the television and explained everything to me. I felt foolish. Story 2. I always knew. I could not understand how my friends believed it was all real. Story 3. I always knew. My father told me it was fake the first time I watched it, which was around the age of 5 or 6. Story 4. I want to say about 12 or so. I did not want to believe it. Anytime you had a conversation about wrestling, some kid would always say, "You know wrestling is fake, right?" I think I started realizing it when I saw the punches were not really connecting. I started thinking, why do they always do that little stomp every time they punch? Also, The Rock was starting to show up in movies, and from there I knew. Story 5. When I was about 5, my dad worked the evening shift. Every Saturday night when he got home, I would get up and watch wrestling with him. Came on at midnight, and we had to go outside and turn the television antenna around to get the signal. I noticed that every time a wrestler was beaten down and looked half dead, he would get a sudden burst of energy and win the match. Every single time, the first wrestler to get beaten down would come back and win. I was 5 when I figured it out. Story 6. Those men are strong athletes. Most people could not perform the athletic feats they do. My grandfather told me wrestling was choreographed when I was 7 or 8. He said if I jumped on a friend's chest while they were lying on the ground, I could kill or seriously hurt them. My grandfather was a wise man. Thank you, Gramps. Story 7. I always knew it was, but act and scripted do not mean fake. Tell that to Sid Vicious' leg, Stone Cold's neck, or Mick Foley's ear, and so on. Story 8. Went through a circular maturing process with regard to professional wrestling. When I was a young kid, I thought it was the coolest thing ever. Then I thought it was silly when I learned it was staged. Finally, as I got older, I came to admire the skill and showmanship. Story 9. Like 5 or 6, and it was an act was at least half of the reason I never gave it much attention. However, I was 31 when I realized the act was no different from other works of fiction I enjoyed. To complain about it being fake is like saying One Piece sucks because no one can actually stretch their arms and limbs like rubber or make arms come out of nothing. It is stage fighting in a play. Of course, the actors are not going to make contact because the point is the narrative reason why the characters the actors are playing are fighting, not that the fighting looks like an actual street brawl. Story 10. My girlfriend tried telling my 6-year-old daughter that it was fake. I was not impressed. I thought it was like saying Santa isn't real. Let her enjoy being the naughty brother and the United Service Organizations being the good one. Then my 18-month-old threw a tantrum. I am not telling them anything. She asked today if the Wyatts are really a family though. Story 11. I never really paid attention to it and felt it was fake when I was a preteen. Then, many years later, I worked a World Wrestling Entertainment event as a follow spot operator and gained a whole new appreciation for it. Sure, I knew it was scripted, they told us who was going to win and how, but I started to realize that the rest of it is just the most intense form of improvisational theater I have ever seen. Those performers are doing amazing acrobatics, coordinating on the fly, and really putting on a fantastic show. It is not sports, but it is not fake. It is theater. Story 12. I saw my dad watching wrestling when I was little, and the announcer said, "Oh, his spine is absolutely shattered after that one." I didn't know the wrestlers' names. A week later, a new episode was airing, and the same guy was there. I thought his spine was broken last time. Dad said, "No, it's fake." My whole world was a lie. I had spent that week thinking that man had died. Story 13. Around 10 or 11, I noticed the punches never really landed, and the crowd reactions were a bit too perfect. Story 14. From the first time I saw it in the early to mid-1970s, I had a friend who, well into his high school years, would get red-faced angry and argue with anyone who said anything about wrestling being fake. Story 15. I loved wrestling as a kid. The Rock, Undertaker, Kane, and Stone Cold were so cool. My memory lapses when I stopped watching, but I remember knowing as a teen that it was scripted. I used to enjoy the dramatic stories they created between wrestlers. They were very intense for me. Story 16. I went to Monday Night Raw about 16 years ago. Let me tell you, professional wrestling is very real for many people, especially little kids or those with developmental disabilities. It is like magic to sit next to one of them and really get the feeling I lost when I realized it was all scripted. Now I cannot really get into any of it. I stopped watching at the end of 1999 when I left for college and did not have cable. Up until that point, I had watched the World Wrestling Federation, now known as World Wrestling Entertainment, since 1985. I knew all the storylines. Now the wrestlers I watched as a kid have children in the business, and I feel even older. Story 17. I'm not sure. I didn't really watch it much growing up. I watched it a bit in my 20s because my then boyfriend was obsessed with it, but by then I could just tell. I have one traumatic memory from when I was a kid, which is probably why I didn't watch it. I saw one episode because my cousin was staying over and wanted to watch it. Can't remember who the wrestlers were, but the plot had one of them up in the audience on the second floor, where the other wrestler's mother was sitting, and he was threatening to throw her over a barrier so she would plunge to her death. I didn't know they were acting, and I was horrified that no one was trying to stop him and that it was being filmed and aired. Story 18. A friend of mine was really into wrestling. I was probably 11 or so and watched WrestleMania with him. His brother and father made it seem like a big deal, pay-per-view and all that. I was invited over, but I just didn't understand. It seemed obvious it was all a show. However, I felt uncomfortable saying anything. It is one thing when they get excited watching live sports, but this was like getting excited about a movie, maybe one you have not seen before. It did not click for me. My friend invited me over again a few days later for Monday Night Wrestling, or was it Thursday? Whatever. I declined both times. At some point, I was at his house again and wrestling was on. It was just me and my friend at this point. While he was fully engrossed in wrestling, I was off to the side playing Link's Awakening on my Game Boy. He snatched it out of my hands and pointed at the TV. But dude, The Undertaker. Okay, listen. This is all fake nonsense. Now give me back my Game Boy. He literally did not talk to me for about 3 months, which is an eternity as a kid. When we finally spoke again, I could tell it was one of those topics we did not discuss. So we did not. Years later, it came up among mutual friends. He said, "Oh yeah, I know it is all fake. Yeah, it only took you about 6 more years to figure that out." Story 19. When Stone Cold beat up Vince in the hospital, I was 7 and appalled. My parents were laughing and I did not understand. They then explained it was not real. Story 20. Wrestling or World Wrestling Entertainment. Wrestling is a real sport. World Wrestling Entertainment is scripted entertainment. When I first saw World Wrestling Entertainment, I noticed the difference. Story 21. 11. I had never heard of it before then, and someone wanted to tease and say it was fake. Story 22. Damn, I misspelled wrestling. It might sound weird, but I was already in high school, I think. I never gave it much thought because I only watched it occasionally. Story 23. I know an adult woman who never watched and did not find out until her 50s. She was flabbergasted that people who knew had watched. Story 24. Around 8. Before that, I had not thought about it. Then my mother said, "Dad was a wrestler in high school." I said, "A wrestler? Really? Like on television?" Television wrestling is all fake. High school wrestling is an actual sport. Oh, even after hearing that, my little brother was big into television wrestling for a while. Story 25. Oh my God. I was about 9 years old. My brother told me it was fake, and I gasped so hard I almost dropped my glitter lip gloss. I still watched it though. Drama is drama. Story 26. I do not know, but I remember when I got my PlayStation Portable, which had internet access. I went to Google and looked up Rey Mysterio without a mask and felt kinda sad. Then I looked up pictures of Maurice and felt better. Story 27. Around age 13. When I was 12, I started working out while watching World Wrestling Entertainment on television. I would do push-ups, squats, sit-ups, and more, aspiring to be as strong as those athletes. When I learned it was scripted, it demotivated me a lot. and I did not return to working out consistently for a very long time. Story 28. When Ultimate Warrior defeated Hulk Hogan, we all saw Hogan get pinned. But no, the referee was down. That's when I figured it out. Story 29. Never thought it was real. My friends made it their duty to make sure of it. Story 30. 10 to 11 is when I started to really understand the scripted nature and kayfabe. I will say this, oddly enough, I do not know if it is because of the era of World Wrestling Entertainment I was watching, which was really good, or because I was getting a bit older, but I think I enjoyed it more when I found out it was scripted. Story 31. I loved wrestling as a kid. The Rock, Undertaker, Kane, and Stone Cold were so cool, but my memory lapses when I stopped watching. Even so, I just remember knowing as a teen that it was fake. I used to be into the drama and stories they made between wrestlers. It was so intense for me. Story 32. I do not know. I was watching Extreme Championship Wrestling for a while. The wrestling was scripted, but you cannot fake jumping off of second-floor arena balconies and putting people through tables. Story 33. I was a kid. It took me longer to realize politicians were more fake than professional wrestlers. Story 34. The same people who vote Republican believe World Wrestling Entertainment wrestling is real. They cannot tell fact from fiction. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Story 35. There was never a moment when I thought it was anything other than what it is. I had to endure all my friends believing it and thinking it was great for years. Story 36. I always knew. My grandmother's cousin was in the business, Eddie Marlin, so I heard a lot about wrestling from a very early age. I was a huge fan. Mr. Perfect was my favorite wrestler. I got to see him wrestle Bret Hart at the Show Me Center in the early 1990s. The main event was Andre versus Hillbilly Jim. Since it was not televised, Andre did not behave like a heel. He was all smiles and high fives. Story 37. Mid-teens, probably old enough to know better, but I was heartbroken. Story 38. When The Undertaker placed the Ultimate Warrior in the casket, the World Wrestling Federation staff did a very poor job opening the casket and performing cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Still enjoyed wrestling. Story 39. When the World Wrestling Federation went from heroes and villains to anti-heroes. When we were young and there was some drama, usually during sweeps we would say, "Oh my God, did you see what happened on?" to adults around us as if it were front-page breaking news. They would say, "Really?" and look shocked, then give our parents a knowing look. Story 40. I never could figure out what it was. I knew it was not real wrestling because it did not follow the rules, and they did things that seemed nonsensical. I did not think too much about it, though. Story 41. A combination of denial, not just being a river in Egypt, and me emotionally and mentally being a middle school kid as a sophomore in high school. Story 42. I was probably 12 or 13. It did not stop me from enjoying it. I just took it as watching any show. I told myself if I could enjoy Spider-Man, then I could enjoy professional wrestling. Story 43. An act? What are you talking about? Original poster. Those guys are real. I have even met one of them, and he was exactly like on the television. Story 44. Pretty young but didn't care. Always saw it in the same realm as movies, theater shows, and other forms of entertainment. It wasn't until I was older that I started to appreciate the craft and how it worked that I really enjoyed it for what it was. Story 45. Very young, it did not take much to realize Big Daddy was not really knocking all those guys unconscious with his gut. Story 46. Wait, what? I am 49. You are telling me Hulk Hogan body slamming Andre the Giant was all scripted nonsense? What is even real anymore? Story 47. In 1986, when Hulk Hogan fought Kamala at Boston Garden, I was very close. It was awful. I also hit Hulk Hogan in the knee with a peanut, and I can see it if I watch the match. Story 48. Something like 8 maybe. I say that because I remember in grade school saying something like, when Hulk Hogan did his hulking up, wouldn't it be funny if someone punched him for real and knocked him out? I remember this because the kid I said it to kept saying they were hitting him. I was like, no, they aren't actually. My dad used to mock wrestling and told me it wasn't real from whenever I first saw it. Story 49. I was about 14 years old. My friend's father was friends with superstar Billy Graham, and he invited us to a photo shoot for a wrestling magazine. Superstar Billy Graham explained how wrestling worked. This was the early 1980s. Story 50. I never really paid attention to it, but I started working in a convenience store. My manager enjoyed it, and I tagged along with him to a match. It was interesting, but that was about all. The store where we worked was near the arena. One evening after a match, two of the wrestlers who said they hated each other walked in together as friends and bought a 12-pack of beer. Story 51. I hadn't thought about it in years, but that is when China died. There was a lot of focus on that, and the wrestling was obviously a scripted show. I am not sure when that actually became apparent between stopping watching it as a kid and it being brought to attention again as a teenager, to be honest. Story 52. I don't remember how old I was, but the first time I saw it, I thought, that's unbelievable. It was sometime in the early 1970s. Story 53, low teens, but that was also the first time I had seen wrestling. Story 54. In all of my 31 years, I have never heard such nonsense. You take that back. Grabs folding chair. Story 55. Sorry, I was never that gullible to think people would fight like that for real, hitting people with chairs, buffoons. Story 56. This reminds me of the time I told my 13-year-old best friend, who was obsessed with Dwayne Johnson, that his name was not Rocky Maivia, but was, in fact, Dwayne Johnson. He had an absolute meltdown and would not talk to me for a week. I remember being absolutely shocked by his visceral reaction and the fact that he actually thought it was all real. I lost a lot of tween respect for him that day. Story 57. I knew it was fake the same way I knew that Mickey Mouse at Disneyland was not actually Mickey Mouse. You just pretend to yourself to make it fun. But of course, it is pretend. Story 58. I do not remember the exact year, but it was around the time I learned about wrestling. Story 59. My mother would regularly destroy my youthful enjoyments. I started running away into the woods at a young age, staying away from home later and later until I turned 18 and disappeared. Please do not be resentful to your children. They are a truly captive audience and only want to live their lives in wonder and curiosity. Story 60. I always knew, and I watched it in the late 1970s and early 1980s when they used razor blades to cut their own faces to get some blood flowing. Except for one time when Jimmy Superfly Snuka missed the turnbuckle and hit his forehead on the metal post. You could see the flap of skin folded over. Story 61. When I learned about wrestling, I was somewhere around 4 to 6 years old. I was never really into wrestling. I don't think I have ever watched more than a couple of minutes of an event. I just didn't really think about it all that much. Story 62. Got home from school one day with World Wrestling Entertainment on. Dad was home early and said, "Turn this off." I said, "It's wrestling though." He replied, "It's fake," and showed me how it was fake, explaining the difference between World Wrestling Entertainment and actual real wrestling. Story 63. I used to get up early to watch Cowboy Bob Kelly when I was 6 or 7, and I thought it was real. I think I realized the truth at about 10. Story 64. I am not American, so it was obvious from the very first minute. Story 65. I think it was about half an hour after I found out what wrestling was. Story 66. Grade 3. Bret Hart's son was in my class, so wrestling was a common topic of conversation. Story 67. The first time I was introduced to the concept of wrestling as a young boy was when another kid matter-of-factly asked me if I knew that wrestling was fake. I was about 8 years old, so I guess I always knew. Story 68. World Wrestling Entertainment and World Wrestling Federation are not fake, but they are performance, which is a big difference. Real wrestling to me is Olympic wrestling or high school or college wrestling. If you watch the latter, you will see the difference. I enjoy both for different reasons. Story 69. Today, at the age of 28, I have never watched wrestling, so I never thought about it. Story 70. There are still some adults who think it is actually real. Story 71. Always did. I used to make fun of it, but then I randomly came across an episode of SmackDown on television and got hooked. Story 72. And to think, Donald Trump appointed the former head of Worldwide Wrestling as the head czar of our education system. He surely wants a poorly educated constituency. Story 73. In the early 1980s, I was under 10 years old. It became obvious from watching that the physicality was wrong. Even the small amount of actual amateur wrestling did not look the same, and it was clear that it was acting. I was so outraged that they lied about it that I not only never watched it again, but I also loathed it because it was a betrayal. Story 74. Never could I have believed it was real. It is just drama for rednecks. Story 75. Bearing in mind that I did not grow up with or follow professional wrestling, I was definitely an adult. It was only when I started using websites such as television tropes that referred to wrestling as if it were fiction that it began to make sense. Story 76. When I was about 8 years old, I found out my friend loved World Wrestling Federation, and I thought it was because he thought it was a good show. I remember being devastated when I realized he believed it was all real. I don't know why, but it is a moment I still think about. Story 77. I always knew the stories were fake because people were dying and coming back to life week to week. That and JR saying things like, "He choked. Slammed him straight to hell. My God." As an adult, I actually appreciate that professional wrestling is a uniquely weird version of an action-oriented stage play with stuntmen and stuntwomen as the actors. They really put their bodies on the line and come up with creative stunts. The 1990s storylines ranged from hilariously silly to completely inappropriate for children. Story 78. It is not fake. People actually died, were hurt, and became permanently disabled. Yet some still believe it is not real. Story 79. Here's a crazy thing. Old wrestling figures will always argue that fans used to think it was real. But you can go back to the first WrestleMania in 1985 and the interviews outside the arena are full of fans. Adults and kids alike. That knew it was just entertainment. There was no golden age of kayfabe. Story 80. Especially when I went to the Will Rogers Auditorium in 1985 to see world-class championship wrestling. There were more real fights in the crowd than there ever were in the ring. After the second fight happened, my dad had enough and said we were leaving. I didn't argue because I was afraid. We got out to his 1969 Chevrolet C10 pickup, and someone stole the car battery instead of the $300 radio that was covered by a hand towel, which was being held down on the dashboard by a plumber's wrench. Hilariously, the thief didn't get far because the battery weighed around 50 pounds. Fort Worth Police Department saw my dad wandering around the parking lot. So they stopped him and asked what he was doing. Looking for my car battery. The officer pointed and asked, "That one." My dad grabbed it, came back to the truck, had me grab some tools, reconnected it, and we went home. Story 81. I never cared about wrestling. My brothers liked it, but I never questioned its authenticity. I was just like, okay, that's obnoxious and nothing like the wrestling in high school. I never knew it was scripted and all for show until my husband told me last year. I am 29 years old. Story 82. I was roughly 10 years old. I was starting to be suspicious, but the three faces of Mick Foley in the Royal Rumble really spelled it all out for me. Story 83. Around 10 to 11 years old, watching crazy stunts of Rey Mysterio, my dad told me it was all show. Story 84. Way too old. I am an idiot for remaining so naive for so long. My brain is not functioning well. Story 85. First time I watched because my dad's friend said this thing is so fake. Story 86. My dad always told me they were acting when I was as young as 6, but I did not fully understand until closer to adulthood exactly how meticulous that acting is. Take Jeff Hardy delivering a swanton bomb off the rafters through Randy Orton, for example. The direct hit is not directly shown, and we can assume the landing was well padded, but even still, that takes skill for nobody to get hurt doing that. All the high flyers are just insane. It is easy to fake Big Show's weapon of mass destruction, but it is hard to fake landing on someone from 10 feet or more up. Story 87. It is real. You just have to watch the Olympic Games rather than World Wrestling Entertainment. Story 88. When I was 8 and just getting into wrestling, my dad explained how everything worked, including belating. Now in my 30s, I still love it. Story 89. I don't watch wrestling. My grandfather loved watching it on TV in the early 1960s. I suspected it was fake, so I asked him about it. He bristled and said it was real. Years later, when I realized how unhappy my grandmother was, I wondered about his love of wrestling and if he was secretly gay. They slept in separate beds early in their marriage. He was a World War II veteran in the Pacific and faced heavy combat. He had to know wrestling was fake. This impression stayed with me, and I have a bias about wrestling, often noticing sexual moments like crotch to mouth, crotch to leg, or dog humping. I apologize. I'm not homophobic. I just can't unsee it. Now, with women's wrestling, there are two audiences, men and lesbians. Feels like a sex show. Story 90. Go back through all the Raja threads. There are a handful of people insisting they have seen worse beatings in World Wrestling Entertainment and that this is fake. The question was asked specifically about The Undertaker. We have grown adults who believe the Earth is flat and that we never went to the moon, but you find it unbelievable that they believe World Wrestling Entertainment is real? Story 91. About 12. Like Father Christmas, I had heard people say it was fake, but I did not want to believe it. I then saw Hulk Hogan being interviewed on breakfast television, and he said that the wrestlers are all great actors. Devastating. Story 92. I was 8 or 9 when my little brother got into wrestling and became a huge Hulk Hogan fan. I felt like I knew right away because some things seemed obvious to me, like how they stomped their feet when they hit someone or how it looked like someone had to jump to help the opponent get up. Story 93. About 13. I did not pay much attention to it when I was younger, then got really into it when I was 10 to 12 in the late 1980s. As I got older, I realized it was basically scripted stunt men rather than a sport, and I shifted completely to watching football and baseball. Story 94. I do not remember a time when it was not a known form of entertainment we were watching. Story 95. 9 out of 10 times when I realized these people were out fighting every week but never had a black eye the following day or week. Story 96. I was 6 years old, and for some reason, I noticed someone not behaving as I thought a normal person would in that situation. Later, I found out it was bad acting. Story 97. When I was 7, my father asked me how many times I thought I could get kicked in the face without bleeding. That was the end of professional wrestling for me. Story 98. I really like this question. I think around 12. Now, when I rewatch, I realize how obvious it was. Story 99. I think I was about 9 or 10 years old. I'm going to be showing my age here, but I loved watching it. I remember watching WrestleMania in 1990, Hulk Hogan versus The Ultimate Warrior, and SummerSlam in the United Kingdom around 1992, when Ultimate Warrior faced Macho Man Randy Savage. I eventually realized it was staged. I still loved watching it even after I knew, but I gave up when I was about 13 or 14. Story 100. I watched it for the first time thinking what my friend had told me was too good to be true. I immediately realized it was just a form of theater when I saw how they didn't throw punches or kicks with any true force. The punches were too slow and unrealistic, so I knew it was fake. I ended up losing a friend because World Wrestling Federation and World Championship Wrestling became his obsession, and I found it horribly boring. Now, I watch mainly because it's an excuse to hang out with my brother-in-law, who is disabled. He buys the family pizza for the pay-per-view, so it's a chance to spend time with my in-laws and have free food. I find myself more interested in how the business works behind the scenes rather than the actual matches, if you can call them that. Story 101. First time watching it, the wrestlers would stomp on the deck every time they made a punch. Story 102. As far as I remember, I always knew. I'm sure at one point it was told to me, but my earliest wrestling memory was watching Big Daddy versus Finlay on a recorded video home system, and I knew it wasn't real then. It was early 1989 as I watched it at my grandparents' while my mother was giving birth to my sister, probably why a match like that stuck. I was 4 then. I probably didn't know what it all meant, but I was aware it was fake like other stuff on television. Story 103. I was about 12 years old. Many people told me it was fake, but I didn't care because it was enjoyable. What convinced me was when there was a wrestler in the corner. The other wrestler got close to him as if to perform an Irish whip from the corner. The camera did not cut quickly enough, and I saw the aggressor whisper in the other wrestler's ear before executing the Irish whip. You could clearly see the extremely tired wrestler in the corner nod his head in agreement. Story 104. What are you talking about? I saw The Undertaker bury a man alive. Story 105. I was about 9 years old. and Beyond the Mat was widely available to watch on our cracked cable box. Before I became a fan, I already knew it was scripted, and the wrestlers protect each other as much as they can. That did not dampen the experience for me because, as a young Texan watching Stone Cold come out, fight hard, drink a few beers, and leave was the coolest thing in the world. Story 106. When I was around 10, I did not start watching it until I was 12 or 13, but knowing it was not real did not mean it was not awesome to watch. Story 107. I guess around 13. My family got a digital video recorder and rewatching it changed everything. Story 108. For many, I imagine it was the day that a man was allowed to walk into the ring with a live snake, and Andre the Giant made no effort to remove it. Story 109. I never really learned it all at once, it sort of faded in. First, I realized the guys turned it off when they weren't on camera. Then I realized everything backstage was an act. Why would the cameras be following that guy in the parking lot when he got jumped? I was about 14 or 15 when I started to wonder why a chair to the head would knock a guy down for good on Friday Night SmackDown. But during the big pay-per-view no-holds-barred match, he takes 10 chairs, a sledgehammer, and multiple slams into a steel cage and still wins. Story 110. I was a child in the 1980s. The act was obvious, especially at that time. Story 111. 7 or 8. I was watching a vertical suplex, and it just occurred to me, that guy has to be helping him do that. Then more things made sense. This was when there were far fewer moves where the person was obviously helping. Story 112. I don't think I ever believed it wasn't scripted. I had many joyless adults on my father's side of the family who mocked me for enjoying wrestling because they said it was fake. Yet, they continue to enjoy movies and scripted television shows. You know that person is not really a meth dealer, right? His name isn't even Walter. It's Brian. Real sports are boring. In wrestling, there is always drama and occasionally characters with supernatural abilities. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.